Thanks to the Nointel Artist, identified by some scholars with Zachary and more recently with Arnoux de Vouet, we have drawings of the pediment dating for 1674, 13 years prior to Morozin's bombardment, which allows us a safe reconstruction and reading of the scene. The poor preservation of the figures, the lack of physical attributes, and their questionable identity leave much room for new identifications. In my talk, by employing an interdisciplinary approach, taking into consideration the literary, iconographic, epigraphic, and topographic evidence, I will offer a new and original identification on the figures P, Q, and R from the west pediment of the Parthenon. The figures P, Q, and R form a group where the figure Q is a female and is surrounded by a pair of standing boys, P on her left and R on her right. The figures Q and P are preserved on a fragmented state and they're exhibited at the British Museum. Nothing survives from figure R. For the reconstruction of the figures, we are based on the drawing of the Nointel Artist. Almost every single scholar identifies figures P, Q, and R from the west pediment of the Parthenon with Oreithyia and her sons, the Boreads, Zetes, and Calais. I will begin my examination on the figures by pointing out the iconographic difficulties of such an identification with Oreithyia and the Boreads. Right after that, I will propose my new and original identification of the figures. The very basic iconographic problem of such an identification with the Boreads, in our case the figures P and R from the west pediment of the Parthenon, is that they appear without wings. In iconography, the Boreads almost appear with wings, which still remains their most basic and characteristic iconographic attribute. Both in the iconography of the archaic and the classical period, mostly attested through black and red figure vase painting, the Boreads, Zetes, and Calais appear with wings. On the left slide, we see a vase of the Lekythos painter, now in Cambridge, dated to 560 BC. On the right slide, we see a volute crater of Sisyphos painter, now in Munich, dated to 420 BC. We note that in both cases, the Boreads appear with wings, having their most basic and characteristic iconographic attribute. In addition to this, there are more problems with the possible depiction of the wingless Boreads on the west pediment of the Parthenon. The depiction of the wingless Boreads clashes with the depiction of Iris identified with figure N. Iris from the west pediment of the Parthenon had attached marble wings, as we can see from the cuttings on her back. It has been pointed out by scholars that sometimes the Boreads appear wingless in iconography, but it seems that this is not the case on the west pediment of the Parthenon. As we have already stated, Iris on the west pediment had attached marble wings, her most basic and characteristic iconographic attribute. This fact indicates that the sculpture or the sculptures of the west pediment depicted the most basic and characteristic iconographic attributes of each figure when this was possible. There are more examples on this. For example, Kekrops, who is identified by scholars with figure B from the west pediment of the Parthenon, had an attached snake, which was glued on the base of the statue. Kekrops, the mythical king of Attica, is a misanthropic and defiant hero, half human and half snake. His mixogenic nature is attested in several different sources, such as Euripides and Apollodorus, and the same applies in iconography. In iconography, Kekrops is depicted as a misanthropic figure, half human and half snake, with the upper body being in human shape, while his legs are snakish. The first iconographic depiction of Kekrops is attested on a black figure Lekythos from Palermo dated to 490 BC, where his mixogenic nature is attested. Returning to the west pediment of the Parthenon, although Kekrops has human legs, his misanthropic nature is suggested by the existence of the snake on which he rests. Taking into consideration this iconographic observation that weakens the identification of the figures with the Boreads and Oreithyia, we see that the proposed identification of the figures is not based on strong iconographic evidence. In fact, the identification is based on secondary literary sources that relate Oreithyia with the Acropolis of Athens. According to Herodotus, the Athenians, right after the end of the war with the Persians, because of the help of Boreads, founded a shrine of Boreads at the area of Ilissos. Other literary sources relate Boreads and Oreithyia with the Acropolis of Athens, attesting that the abduction of Oreithyia by Boreads took place at the temple of Athena Polias on the Acropolis of Athens. It is true that literary sources relate the myth of the Boreads and Oreithyia with the Acropolis of Athens, so the identification of the figures with the Boreads and Oreithyia is not impossible. It has to be pointed out, though, that the shrine of Boreads was on the area of Ilissos instead of the Acropolis. But by making some iconographic observations and taking into consideration the literary sources, the myths, the cultic and the topographic evidence, I will propose a new and original identification of the figures P, Q, and R from the west pediment of the Parthenon. Paying close attention in the examination of figures P, Q, and R, we see that they are highly related to each other, especially regarding the relevance of the children figures P and R with the female figure Q. We see that figure Q's right knee has a mark from the three fingers of P's right hand, and additionally, figure P seems to embrace figure R. Similarly, figure R has one foot on the seat of Q. On the west pediment of the Parthenon, we observe that there are other groups of female figures accompanied by young children, like the groups of P, Q, and R. Ridgway attests that the iconographic motive of the depiction of female figures accompanied with children is unusual for the architectural sculpture of the classical period and suggests that such a chirotrophic motive is more suitable for the architectural sculpture of the Roman period. Having this observation in mind, as well as the topography and the myths of the Acropolis, I will propose a different identification for the figures P, Q, and R. In one of his passages, Apollodorus attests that the king of Athens, Pantheon, married Zevxippe and had 4 sons. 4 kids: Erechtheus, Vutis, Procne, and Philomela. In another passage, Apollodorus attests that when Pandion died, his sons divided their father's inheritance between them. Oreithyia got the kingdom, and Voutis got the priesthood of Athena Polias and Poseidon Oreithyia. Oreithyia and Voutis are major heroes of the Acropolis of Athens, both connected with the goddess Athena and the cults of the Acropolis. Pausanias attests that Oreithyia and Voutis were receiving cult at the Erechtheion, the most sacred temple on the Acropolis of Athens, where the statue of Athena Polias was placed. It was on the wider side of the Erechtheion itself, where the contest between Athena and Poseidon took place, the episode that was depicted on the west pediment of the Parthenon. Additionally, at the Erechtheion were placed the martyria of the gods, the sacred olive of Athena and the salt sea of Poseidon. Given that the cult of Oreithyia and Voutis was topographically connected with the content of Athena and Poseidon with the contest of Athena and Poseidon for the land of Attica. Oreithyia is the oldest and most important of all the heroes worshipped at the Acropolis of Athens, given that his relation to Athena and the cults of the Acropolis are already attested during the time of Homer, both in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Several different literary sources attest that the Athenians of the classical period called themselves Oreithyes, descendants of the mythical king Oreithyus, paying tribute to this important Athenian hero. One of the most important characteristics of Oreithyus, and what concerns us the most in terms of the examination of figures P, Q, and R from the west pediment of the Parthenon, is his curatropic and cultic relation to the goddess Athena, as well as his relation to the ideology of autochthony. There are several Attic vases alluding to Athena's cultic and curatropic connection with Oreithyus. The fact that most of these vases come from the Acropolis itself suggests a strong association between the mythological episode, the iconography, and topography of the Acropolis. A red figure calyx dating from the mid-5th century and attributed to the Penthesilea painter depicts Athena and Oreithyus. Athena wears a diadem and she seems to hold a spear with her left hand. Next to Athena stands a boy, Oreithyus, drinking with both hands from a fiale, a detail that shows the undeniable cultic context of the scene. Just above Oreithyus' head is an owl, standing on an olive branch, further strengthening the cultic context of the scene. There are several iconographic elements that suggest a curatropic connection between Athena and Oreithyus. Athena wears a diadem instead of a helmet and is in a relaxed pose, holding the spear more like a staff rather than a weapon, suggesting a maternal and curatropic context of the goddess. Other examples from the Acropolis, including Eleutherophoros, dating from the end of the 5th century, convey a similar, albeit with some minor differences, cultic and curatropic context between the hero and the goddess. Erica Simon has pointed out that Athena is presented in both vases in a curatropic manner, suggesting that in both vases Oreithyus is drinking the offered nectar by the goddess. Bootis, just like Oreithyia, having examined Oreithyia, pointing out his connection with Athena and the myths and cults of the Acropolis, let us now turn on the examination of Bootis. Bootis, just like Oreithyia, has his origins in the Archaic period, since he is already attested in Hesiod as a son of Poseidon. Additionally, Bootis was considered the mythical founder of the archaic genus of Eteovoutade. We have already stated that according to the testimony of Pausanias, Bootis was worshipped at the Erechtheion, along with Poseidon Oreithyia. Bearing this in mind, there is a strong possibility that Hesiod's testimony may reflect Bootis' cultic association with Poseidon during the Archaic period. Although a less famous hero compared to Oreithyia, Bootis has his own range, patterns, and motives. Without any doubt, the main characteristic of Bootis was his leading role in the cult of Athena Polias and Poseidon Oreithyia, as attested in Apollodorus. The connection of Bootis with the cults of the Acropolis is further strengthened by the very etymology of his name. Icicius attests the name Bootis as the slayer of Vox during the festival of Bouphonia, alternatively called the Hippolia. The festival of Bouphonia is considered a primeval festival connected with the Acropolis of Athens. The possible involvement of Bootis at the festival of Bouphonia brings to our mind the testimony in the Iliad which mentions the sacrifice on bulls and rams for Oreithyia. In terms of his iconography, the statue of Moschophoros, dating to 570 BC, has been interpreted by scholars as a possible depiction of the sacrifice to Oreithyia or Zeus Polius. Although far from being certain, there is a possibility that Bootis was depicted in the guise of a priest, offering the sacrifice either to Athena Polias and Oreithyia or to Zeus Polius. The existence of a sanctuary for Zeus Polius located on the east of the altar of Athena Polias indicates the importance of the cult of Zeus on the Acropolis, as well Bootis' cultic persona. No matter of how certain this identification is, the possible depiction of Bootis in the guise of a priest shows his important role in the cults of the Acropolis of Athens. Continuing with the examination of the iconography of Bootis, other suggestions of his depiction has been proposed by scholars. More specifically, Bootis has been identified with a male figure on South Metope 14 of the Parthenon. The South Metopes of the Parthenon depict the mythological episode of the Kentavromachi, and it has been suggested by scholars that Bootis may be the male figure depicted in Metope 14. Far from being certain on both possible depictions of Bootis, it has to be noted that all his proposed depictions come from the Acropolis of Athens itself. This suggests a connection between the hero and the iconography and the topography of the Acropolis. There is no denial that the stronger connection of Bootis with the cults of the Acropolis of Athens derives through the genus of Eteovoutade. According to several literary sources, Bootis was considered the mythical founder of the genus of Eteovoutade. The genus of Eteovoutade was considered one of the oldest and most distinguished geni, given that from this genus derived the priestess of Athena Polias and Poseidon Erechtheus. We have already stated that Athena, Poseidon Erechtheus, and Bootes himself were worshipped at the Erechtheion on the Acropolis, a fact that shows their close and undeniable cultic relevance. Furthermore, it has been argued by scholars that the genus of the Theovutade were involved in the building of Erechtheion itself. Pausanias, in his description of the Erechtheion, informs us that on the walls of the Erechtheion were the paintings representing members of the genus of Theovutade. Given that, it is very likely that Bootes, the mythological founder of the genus of Theovutade, may have been part of the murals of the Erechtheion. Having examined the figures of Erechtheus and Bootes, whom identify with figures P and R of the west pediment of the Parthenon, let us now turn on the examination of figure Q, which I identify with Zevxippe. Scholars who made iconographic observation of the treatment of figure Q have suggested that it is possible that figure Q was sitting on a stepped altar. This iconographic observation relates figure Q with a mythical priestess, possibly Oreithyia. We have already stated that Bootes was considered the mythical founder of the genus of Theovutade, the most important genus regarding the cults of the Acropolis and the city of Athens in general, given that from this genus derived the priestess of Athena Polias and Poseidon Erechtheus. Having that in mind, the cultic and hieratic context of Zevxippe as mother of Bootes is obvious. We may not have a literary testimony on the cultic context of Zevxippe, but I don't consider impossible that during antiquity Zevxippe may have been considered a mythical priestess of Athena Polias. Unlike Erechtheus and Bootes, it is true that we have no testimony regarding a cult of Zevxippe at the Acropolis of Athens. Her existence during the Archaic period is indicated only indirectly, but cannot be completely rejected. We have already mentioned Hesiod's testimony about Bootes, calling him a son of Poseidon. Since Hesiod's work Echoe was a catalogue of women, it is very likely that Zevxippe may have played a significant role, as suggested by some scholars. Scholars, recognizing her important role in the myths of the Acropolis as mother of Erechtheus and Bootes, have proposed several different iconographic identifications of Zevxippe. More specifically, scholars have identified Zevxippe with one of the two depicted women on South Metope 20 from the Parthenon. In the picture, we see the drawing of South Metope 20 of the Parthenon by Nointel Artist. Other possible iconographic depictions of Zevxippe have been proposed by scholars, such as a crater in the Syracuse Museum attributed to the Dinos painter. The crater is dating to 410 BC, and a lot of the depicted figures, such as Akamas, Pantheon, Chiron, and Inepes, are inscribed. It has been suggested that the female figure next to Pantheon, who holds an inohoi and has peplus in her arms, may be Zevxippe, wife of Pantheon, although her name is not inscribed. Having examined Zevxippe, we come to an end regarding my proposed identifications on figures P, Q, and R from the west pediment of the Parthenon. By concluding my proposed identifications on figures P, Q, and R from the west pediment of the Parthenon with Erechtheus, Zevxippe, and Bootes, are based on the following factors. First, on Oreithyia' high relevance with the goddess Athena, especially in that curatoric and nature context as depicted on the west pediment of the Parthenon. Second, on Oreithyia' high relevance to the myths, topography, and cults of the Acropolis of Athens. Third, on Voutis' relevance with the cult of Athena Polias and Poseidon Oreithyia, as well as the topography and cults of the Acropolis. Fourth, on Oreithyia and Voutis' cults at the Oreithion, on this very place where the contest between Athena and Poseidon took place, and where the martyria of the gods were placed, Athena's olive tree and Poseidon's salt sea. All in all, the episode was depicted on the west pediment of the Parthenon, thus highly relevant to the topography of the Oreithion. In terms of specific identifications, I believe that figure R is Oreithyia, given his proximity to figures S and T, identified with Ion and Creusa, grandson and daughter of Oreithyia. For the same proximity reasons, I identify figure P with Voutis, given his proximity to figures O and M from the west pediment, Amphitrite and Poseidon, mother and father of Voutis, according to some literary sources. By concluding, I believe that my proposed identification of figures P, Q, and R of the west pediment of the Parthenon with Oreithyia, Zevxippe, and Voutis is at least as possible as the previous proposed identification of the figures with the Boreads and Oreithyia. The Boreads, in contrast to Oreithyia, have never been depicted in iconography in curatoric context. Additionally, they are not related to Athena and Poseidon, and they did not receive cult on the Acropolis of Athens. In total contrast, Oreithyia and Voutis were related to the protagonistic deities of the episode, Athena and Poseidon, and they were receiving cult on the Acropolis of Athens, more specifically at the Oreithion, at the very place where the contest took place and also where the martyria of the gods were placed, Athena's olive tree and Poseidon's salt sea. For the literary, iconographic, topographic, and cultic reasons I have mentioned above, I believe that an identification of figures P, Q, and R with Oreithyia, Zevxippe, and Voutis is at least the same, if not more possible, with the Boreads and Oreithyia. Now I would like to thank you for attending my presentation, and below follows my email for anyone that wants to get in touch, as well as my page on academia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. Thank you. You can see applause from other people online. We're also in an action room. In a minute, I will turn around the screen so that you can see us. We're not terribly many, but we are some. Possibly I need to angle this a bit differently as well. But live people in your audience as well as people online. So
great. I'm glad that we're gradually returning to what was considered normal some years back.
yeah, some form of normality here, definitely. Right, so colleagues, if you have questions for our speakers. Okay, Amy says you can see the lights and not the people. All right, fair enough. I've got so much reflection on the screen up here, I'm not entirely sure what I can see or what can we see. Hopefully that's a bit